At 3:17 a.m. Washington time this morning, a document quietly signed inside the White House may have just triggered the most dangerous rupture between the United States and Canada in over half a century. U.S. President Donald Trump approved an emergency order slapping an 87.4% tariff on Canadian aluminum, timber, and uranium, a move that economists say effectively detonates a trade war inside the world's most integrated economic alliance. But the real shock came 9 hours later. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney responded with a financial strike few believed Ottawa would ever attempt, freezing $318 billion in American corporate assets operating across Canada's energy, mining, and banking sectors. Financial markets began reacting within minutes. Yet while major television networks are still piecing together what happened, the reality is far more serious. This confrontation could destabilize the entire North American economy within days. So before we go any further, subscribe now, because the timeline you're about to hear is something the mainstream media is still struggling to explain. In the next 12 minutes, we're going to break down exactly what just happened behind the scenes of this rapidly escalating US-Canada confrontation. First, we'll uncover the hidden economic trigger that pushed Washington to impose those unprecedented tariffs overnight. Second, we'll examine the financial counterstrike by Prime Minister Mark Carney that froze hundreds of billions in American assets and sent quiet shockwaves through global markets. And finally, we'll walk through the 3 possible scenarios that could unfold before the 48-hour diplomatic deadline expires, including the one outcome that could fracture the G7 alliance itself. To understand why this confrontation escalated so suddenly between 2 of the world's closest allies, we need to step back and examine the chain of events that led to the decision signed at 03:17 a.m. in Washington. Because according to several economic analysts and former officials familiar with North American trade structures, the tariffs themselves are only the visible surface of a much deeper geopolitical struggle. Let's break this down step by step. Evidence 1. The strategic metals panic. The first trigger revolves around strategic minerals and industrial metals, materials that have quietly become the backbone of modern geopolitical power. Aluminum, uranium, lithium, cobalt. These are not just commodities anymore. They are the raw materials behind electric vehicles, aerospace systems, nuclear energy, and military technology. Canada currently controls one of the largest secure supplies of these materials within the Western Alliance. According to industry data, the country produces roughly 60% of the primary aluminum consumed in North America and supplies critical minerals essential for advanced manufacturing. Over the past year, however, a quiet shift began to worry policymakers in Washington. Several Canadian provinces opened negotiations with international mining partners to expand extraction of lithium and cobalt reserves in northern territories. The combined projected investment value of those projects was estimated at over $120 billion. On paper, these were normal industrial deals. But inside Washington, officials began viewing them through a completely different lens: supply chain vulnerability. Because if those mineral contracts eventually linked Canadian resources to foreign buyers outside the United States, it would weaken the tightly integrated North American production system that has existed for decades. That is why the tariffs announced overnight was so unusually severe. An 87.4% tariff is not just a trade measure. Economists describe it as something closer to a financial blockade. It forces companies to reconsider where they buy materials immediately. And that is exactly what appears to have triggered Ottawa's response. Evidence 2. Canada's financial counterstrike. When Prime Minister Mark Carney announced the freezing of $318 billion in American corporate assets, many observers were stunned by the scale of the retaliation. Canada and the United States share one of the deepest economic partnerships in the world. On a typical day, nearly $2 billion in goods and services cross the border. For Ottawa to suddenly target American corporate investments was an extraordinary escalation. But there is a reason Carney chose this specific move. Before entering politics, Mark Carney served as Governor of the Bank of England and Governor of the Bank of Canada, making him one of the most experienced financial policymakers in the world. Analysts believe his response was carefully designed not as a symbolic protest, but as a pressure point directly aimed at Washington's corporate base. Energy companies operating in Alberta, mining firms extracting metals in Quebec, major American banks financing infrastructure projects across Canadian provinces. Together, those investments add up to hundreds of billions of dollars. By freezing them temporarily, Ottawa sent a clear message. Economic pressure can flow both directions across the border. Within hours of the announcement, several investment firms reportedly began reviewing exposure to North American supply chains. That is when global markets started paying attention. Evidence 3. The silent security shock. But the most surprising development may not be economic at all. According to defense analysts, one of the most sensitive aspects of the crisis involves military coordination structures that the public rarely hears about. For decades, the United States and Canada have jointly operated the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, responsible for monitoring airspace across the continent. This partnership has been one of the most stable military arrangements in modern history. Yet sources inside defense circles say tensions between the two governments are now quietly spilling into conversations about intelligence coordination. While neither side has publicly announced military changes, the political friction alone has raised concerns among NATO observers. Because if political mistrust begins affecting defense cooperation, even symbolically, it could introduce uncertainty into one of the West's most important security systems. And uncertainty is exactly what financial markets hate the most. Evidence 4. The warning from global investors. One reason this confrontation has drawn so much attention so quickly is the reaction from major financial figures. Legendary investor Warren Buffett, whose investment philosophy has long emphasized stability in North American markets, recently warned that escalating trade conflicts between major allies can create ripple effects far beyond the industries involved. According to Buffett, when two deeply integrated economies start imposing aggressive financial pressure on each other, investors begin questioning the reliability of the entire regional system. And once that uncertainty spreads, the economic impact can multiply rapidly. Supply chains adjust, capital flows shift, corporate investment decisions change. In other words, what begins as a dispute between governments can evolve into a structural economic shock. And that is precisely why analysts across the G7 are watching this situation so closely. Because the United States and Canada together represent one of the largest integrated economic zones in the world. Disruptions here do not stay local. They echo across global markets. At this point, you can begin to see why this story is far more complex than a simple tariff dispute. It touches critical minerals, financial leverage, defense cooperation, and investor confidence, 4 pillars that underpin the modern global economy. And if you're starting to understand just how serious this situation could become, hit the like button so more people can see this analysis. Because what happens next may determine whether this confrontation de-escalates quietly or spirals into something much larger. Right now, the most important factor in this crisis is time. Diplomatic insiders say the next 48 hours could determine whether this confrontation becomes a temporary economic dispute or the beginning of a much deeper fracture inside the Western alliance. Because both Washington and Ottawa now face a set of decisions that could reshape the balance of power across North America. Let's walk through the 3 scenarios analysts believe could unfold before the clock runs out. Scenario 1. Full de-escalation. In the first scenario, both governments step back before the situation spirals further. Washington could quietly soften the 87.4% tariff order, perhaps reducing it or delaying implementation while negotiations begin. In response, Ottawa would likely release the $318 billion in frozen American assets and frame the outcome as a diplomatic compromise. This would allow both sides to claim victory domestically. The United States could argue it successfully forced Canada to reconsider its strategic mineral policies. Canada, meanwhile, could present the result as proof that it defended its economic sovereignty. If this scenario happens, global markets would likely stabilize quickly. The confrontation would be remembered as a short but intense economic standoff, dramatic but ultimately contained. But many analysts believe the next scenario is far more realistic. Scenario 2. Partial compliance. Under this scenario, neither side fully backs down. Instead, negotiations produce a limited compromise. Canada might adjust or delay certain mineral agreements that raised concerns in Washington, while the United States maintains reduced tariffs on key materials like aluminum or uranium. On the surface, the crisis would appear resolved. But the deeper consequence would be a permanent shift in trust between the two countries. Corporate investors would start diversifying supply chains. Governments across the G7 might begin rethinking how dependent they are on North American trade structures. The alliance would survive, but with new cracks forming beneath the surface. And then there is the third scenario, Scenario 3, full economic breakdown. If neither government backs down within the next 48 hours, the confrontation could escalate dramatically. Washington could expand tariffs beyond metals and minerals, targeting Canadian energy exports, manufactured goods, and agricultural products. Ottawa, in response, could extend its financial freeze and introduce new restrictions on American investment or cross-border financial operations. At that point, the crisis would no longer be a policy dispute. It would become a full-scale economic confrontation between the two largest partners in the Western Hemisphere. Supply chains would break apart. Investment flows could freeze. Markets would react with immediate volatility. And the ripple effects would not stop in North America. Because once the world's most integrated economic partnership begins to fracture, every allied economy connected to it feels the shock. Which brings us to the final question that now hangs over this crisis. Who blinks first? Right now the clock is ticking. What began at 03:17 a.m. inside the White House has already evolved into one of the most serious economic confrontations between the United States and Canada in modern history. A single tariff decision triggered $318 billion in frozen assets, rattled investor confidence, and forced governments across the G7 to quietly monitor what happens next. If neither side steps back before the 48-hour window closes, the consequences could extend far beyond North America. Supply chains, financial markets, and long-standing alliances may all face pressures they were never designed to handle. The real question now is simple. Did Washington push too far? Or did Ottawa finally decide it would no longer accept economic pressure from its closest ally? Tell me what you think in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want to follow the next developments in this unfolding crisis, subscribe and turn on notifications because this story is far from over.